The report we are releasing today is the culmination of over 2 years of work examining the enrollment and performance trends of African American students in California. Given the annual analyses we conduct as an organization at CCSA, we first noticed this trend a few years back. As we saw the trends that you will hear about today that we're presenting in this report persist over time, it became very clear to us that this was a key area that we needed to investigate further so that we could understand the breadth of these trends, as well as try to uncover some of the practices that might underlie them. Given the history, in particular, of African Americans in the U.S. and the persistent achievement gaps that African American students suffer from, we felt it was particularly important to unearth the success of charter schools in educating this traditionally underserved population of students. Toward that end, we conducted a host of analyses, both quantitative and qualitative, as we will overview in this report. We assessed African American enrollment, average API scores, as well as English language arts and math proficiency rates. And we did that using the California Department of Education's publicly available data files. We analyzed these data across grade levels, a number of key districts across the state, as well as a number of charter-specific variables. We also assessed a subsample of schools that serve a significant population of African American students, i.e. those who have enough African American students to receive an African American API score on our internal measure, which Jed referenced, our annual school performance prediction, percent predicted API measure. This measure compares a school's actual API to their predicted API based on regression analyses that control for the impact of student background on school performance. We also assess this sample of schools on our 3-year similar students measure, as well as our broader accountability framework. In addition to these quantitative analyses, we conducted 3 case studies of schools doing an exceptional job of serving African American students. In order to be a case study school, each one of these schools had to have an African American API score of at least 800, and their African American ELA and math proficiency rate had to be at 65% or higher, which is above the state average. We chose 3 schools operating in major urban districts that were also predominantly African American. Those schools were Kittbridge in Oakland, Watts Learning Center in Los Angeles, and our host for today, PS7 here in Sacramento. With that wealth of information, we found a number of promising trends. I'm going to highlight a few of those key findings for you now, and of course direct you to the report where there is much more detail. I think it's about 75 pages, so there's a lot more to hear than what we have time to present right now. African American students are enrolled in state charter schools at higher rates than are in our traditional public schools. While African American students represent 6% of California public school students, they represent 9% of charter public school students. This trend has been persistent over time despite a decline in African American families and students in the state of California. And we have seen this trend persist across grade levels and in 4 of the 7 key districts we assessed. Here in Sacramento, African American students are over twice as likely to attend a charter school. We also assessed the statistical relationship between African American enrollment and school API performance, a relationship, as Jed mentioned, that is typically negative. We did that so that we could understand if chartering was diminishing that race-based trend, and that's exactly what we found. Typically, a school's API score decreases as African American enrollment increases. However, in charter schools, that negative relationship is 3 times weaker, or 1/3 as strong. Using our internal accountability framework, again, which controls for the impact of student background on performance, we found that charters serving a significant population of African American students are about 4 times as likely than similar traditional public schools to outperform their predicted performance. Looking at more traditional performance measures, charters have consistently earned higher African American API scores, and you see a visual of that to the far left at the bottom. This trend is true statewide among elementary and middle schools, as well as in Los Angeles, Oakland, Sacramento, and San Francisco. And we also see similar trends when we look at ELA and math proficiency. Performance here in Sacramento has been particularly impressive, and we have a brief snapshot of that, of the API performance over time for Sacramento. Here in Sacramento, charter public schools have substantially improved African American performance, growing African American API scores from an average of 660 to 836, an increase, yes, it's worth a hand clap. 836. That is an increase of 176 points in just 4 years. It's phenomenal. When you sit with this data day in and day out and you see how slowly API can creep up, 176 points is phenomenal. That average 2010 African American API score of 836 was 154 points higher than that for traditional public schools, which have only grown 13 API points for their African American students since school year 2006-07. 13 compared to 176. Here in Sacramento, African American English and proficiency rates are equally impressive, where charters rates were 20.3 percentage points higher than traditional public schools for ELA and 24.6 percentage points higher for math. They were also higher than the statewide proficiency rates for all students, thereby closing the achievement gap for African American students in the Sacramento City District. Again, worth a clap. Statewide, the achievement gap for African American students definitely persists. And you can see that here in the graph on the bottom in the middle. However, charters are doing a better job of narrowing that gap, with gaps that are approximately 19 API points lower on average. In general, few schools fall into the category of PS7 and the other schools that we profiled in this report of being highly effective educators of African American students. But charters are more likely to be in that category. While charters make up only 9% of schools statewide, they represent 39% of highly effective schools for African American students. Here, of course, at PS7, this is one great example of such a school in Sacramento that has eliminated the achievement gap for its African American students. Eliminated. PS7 has improved its African American students' API performance by 159 points from school year 06-07 to school year 09-10. 159 points, to a high of 908 at that time, and as was said earlier, to 911 in 2011. PS7 has also improved ELA proficiency from 47% to 73%, and math from 50% to 87%. And we do want to emphasize these numbers are well above state averages, not just for African American students, but are well above state averages for all students. Proficiency rates for all students across the state hover in the 50s, high 50s at best. So these are very impressive rates and are really going beyond closing the achievement gap. What you're seeing here is African American students performing better than most students in the entire state on average. These highly impressive results are significantly better than that of African American students attending the district's traditional public schools, where African American performance was 184 API points lower than that of students at PS7, and proficiency rates were 30 and 38% lower in ELA and math, respectively. Lastly, in conducting our case studies, we first combed scholarly literature about best practices for educating African American students, from which we then created our observation, interview, and focus group protocols that we use when we went to our case study schools to examine them. With amazing precision, what we observed at our 3 case study schools, which of course included PS7, was exactly what the literature said we should see in a school that is effectively educating African American students. And we have a summary of those key findings here with a wealth of detail in the report. In the report, you will find literal examples of exact practices, exact policies that are being implemented in these schools that are destroying the achievement gap. What did we see? We saw a strong focus on academic rigor. We saw high expectations for students, also for parents, and also for staff. We saw an understanding and catering of students' diverse needs. We saw strong, data-driven decision-making. These schools analyze their students' performance data literally often on a daily basis, certainly on a weekly basis. We saw incorporation of cultural and life relevance to engage students. We saw caring interactions and relationships. We saw strong school culture. These schools were very intentional about the policies they implemented, about the norms that they cultivated within their schools, and everything they did was strategic, and it was explicit toward a specific goal. We saw standards-based, results-focused, curricular and instructional practices. And all of this with high levels of accountability for all constituents to ensure that all of these features were working at their best. In sum, what these case studies illuminated is that what effective schools are doing and what African American students need is simply good teaching, an equitable educational experience. And that's what we saw here at PS7 as well as at Kittbridge and Watts Learning Center. And I feel pretty certain that had we had the time to go to all of the schools that fit into this category, which again was very small. I'm talking about 20 schools in the entire state who had achievement high enough for African American students to qualify for our case study. But I'm pretty sure that we would have seen the same practices. As I said, there are many more findings and much more detail than we can overview at this time, and we definitely ask you to review the report for those details.